Right. Hello, everyone. And hello, everyone online. It's really great to see you here today on this very cold and blustery and windy, horrible Vienna day. We had some lovely weather and it's all turned bad. I'm not going to blame it on our visiting guest speaker, though. That's not what I'm going to do here today. It's really a delight to welcome Professor Axel Timmermann today to give a talk. He actually has been and given a HEAS talk previously, and that's because he usually comes here at about this time for the EGU conference, which is, of course, the big European Geosciences Union meeting that takes place here in Vienna every year about this time. And has, 20,000 delegates. That's a massive, massive conference. So let me just give you a little bit of background about our very eminent speaker today, Axel Timmermann. He did his PhD research in Germany initially at the University of Marburg in physics and theoretical physics. So he did his PhD as well later in Germany, but at the University of Hamburg in meteorology. And then following that, he held a series of postdocs in the Netherlands and then in Germany, in Kiel. And then he moved to the University of Hawaii to work as an associate professor and then as a full tenured professor from 2009 to 2016. In 2017, he moved to South Korea, which is where he has remained to this day, in the very impressive IBS Center for Climate Physics, or ICCP, at Busan National University. And last year, Axel organized a really terrific conference, which I was privileged to attend, which was one of the best conferences that I've been to in the last few years in terms of interdisciplinarity. The number of people that were there was really inspiring. And Axel kicked off the conference with an amazing piano recital, which many people would remember fondly as well. The great thing about Axel is he's a polymath. He's working on lots of different areas, mainly linked with modeling and climate modeling. So he's interested in things like El Nino, human migrations and climate, glacial dynamics, abrupt climate changes, sea level rises, climatic predictability and instability. He's been a co-author on many, many publications and papers over the years. So today he's going to talk, as you can see, about simulating mammals, including humans, in the changing environment of the late Pleistocene. It's a real pleasure and privilege to welcome you again, Axel, and the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Tom. And also, as always, it's a real pleasure to be back in Vienna. And I'm not sure about the causality of the rain, because I've been here now 3 times, and every time it rained. So there might be something more than just a correlation there. Anyways, first of all, this is not my design, the green front page. It was given to me kindly, and I like it very much. Actually, it's a special design, and so the title, Tom already mentioned, of my talk is Simulating Mammals, including humans in the changing environment of the late Pleistocene. And this is, of course, collaborative work, mostly with my postdoc currently, Tushara Venugopal, Shiwei Fang, and Pasquale Raya from the University of Naples, Kyung-Suk Yoon from our center, and also Alessandro Montanaro from University of Naples. Okay, let's start. First slide, I see. All right. Okay, good. Just a few words about our center. The IBS Center for Climate Physics at Busan National University in South Korea is abbreviated ICCP, not to be mixed with IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And we started our center in 2017. And we are based at Busan National University in the upper 2 floors of this building here, with beautiful views, vistas into the valley and into the towards the Yeongnam Alps. So it's a really spectacular area in South Korea. In 2018, we bought one of Korea's fastest supercomputers for our research, and we also established an isotope geochemistry lab to analyze stalagmites and reconstruct past climate changes using stalagmite data. So over the last 8 years, we had about 100 members from 17 different countries. Currently, we are 54 from 12 different countries and 6 professors, and the majority of people in our center are women. And we're always looking forward for bright minds. Okay, So simulating mammals and the response to climate change is a little bit the purpose of our research, and it involves essentially understanding the interaction, of course, amongst different mammals. We have competition, we have predation, but also the impact of external forcing such as climate and other environmental changes. Okay, so this is illustrated here. We have a large number of mammal species on our planet, over 6,000. We are going to focus today only on 2,171, including humans. And of course, they all interact with each other. There is competition, there are predation, there are certain trophic structures in the system. So this is all biology, but we're particularly interested in how external forcings, in particular glacial cycles, changes in Earth's rain bands, monsoon systems, and so on, can impact these mammal species, and also the interactions amongst these different species. So this sounds like an almost impossible task to do, to build a computer model for all or almost all mammal species on our planet, but we tried at least to approach that challenge. And if we have a model that is capable of quantifying the impact of climate change, environmental changes on mammals, we could also study extinction events, causes for extinction, megafauna extinction, for instance. We could understand internal ecosystem variability. What's the null hypothesis? So let's just say we have a complicated ecosystem model. Is it going to be a stable system? Are we going to have drift in the system? Of course, there is, and so on and so forth. So there are fundamental questions also even of ecosystem dynamics that we could address with this. Ecosystem functionality under glacial conditions. Are there changes in the entire trophic structure? And conservation biology. It's a wonderful tool actually to study current ideas about rewilding certain animals. So because we can introduce certain mammal species into certain places and see what ripple effect that could have on ecosystems worldwide. And of course, it's a wonderful tool for global change biology. Okay, let's start. I will first talk about the climate and vegetation model that we're using as a main driver, as a forcing. So this is the main part. And to begin with, and then we are diving into the structure and the philosophy of building this mammal and human dispersal model. And the final goal is essentially to have predictions of the biomass of 2,170 mammal species as a function of time and space, past to future. Okay, so first, what is a climate model? And there is still a little bit the misconception that a climate model is a statistical model where we put in some data and some future data come out. That is not the case. A climate model is a physical model. So it's based on the principles of physics. And that includes, of course, fluid dynamics. We can describe the ocean and the atmospheric circulation as fluid dynamical systems. That we have to deal with the thermodynamics, energy conservation, and so on. But also quantum mechanics is really important because the greenhouse effect, the absorption of long-wave radiation by greenhouse gases such as CO2 is a quantum mechanical effect. And electromagnetism is important because we need to study how radiation actually gets transmitted in the atmosphere. And there are certain factors that we cannot simulate very well. Let's say trees or plants in general. Clouds are very complicated. The detailed physics in clouds happens on droplet or even smaller scales. So to simulate a cloud, of course, we cannot simulate every water molecule on our planet. So we have to describe it. And these are so-called parameterizations. And then there are factors that are more external, such as, of course, humans, greenhouse warming, or other factors. In particular, for ice ages, we have to deal with the changes in Earth's astronomical orbits. Okay, so this is a set of equations. If we had to discuss these equations, it would probably take 2 years and weekly sessions. I won't go into this today, but just say that these are complicated equations that no human on our planet can solve. So we use computers for that. And a computer code of these model equations that tries to solve these model equations is typically about 1 million lines of Fortran code. And this can only be run on the fastest computers on our planet. And then what we get out eventually is a global coverage of temperatures, rainfall, winds, any physical climate variable that you're interested in. But also in some Earth system models, we are also looking at biogeochemical variables such as vegetation or the net primary productivity in the ocean and so on. Okay, so that gives you an idea, a very rough idea what a climate model is. And we used a particular one, the Community Earth System model, and there is a certain version of that. And the resolution is rather coarse, so about 3.6 degrees. So this is the entire Earth is covered in a mesh, and mesh distance is about 3.6 degrees. But we had to do this because we want to run the entire climate history of the last 3 million years. So we have to make some compromises. Okay, what do we need as external forcings? I already mentioned the changes in Earth's astronomical conditions are characterized by 3 factors: changes in Earth's obliquity with a 41,000 year cycle, then changes in the eccentricity of Earth's orbit around the sun with 100 and 400,000 year dominant variability cycles, and the precession Earth's axis wobble, if you like, with timescales of about 20,000 years. Okay, let me just run it once more. Okay, and also it's important, of course, if we are looking at ice ages, our model itself cannot build up the ice sheets over North America and in Eurasia. So we had to use the ice sheet forcing from a different climate model, and that has been validated against observational data. And of course, we need the greenhouse gas forcing changes of CO2 in particular over the last 3 million years as a key driver for our system. If our model had a fully interactive carbon cycle, we would be able to simulate this interactively, but this is not the case. So we have to use all the available information from ice cores and from other climate models in order to use this greenhouse gas forcing. Okay, so the model was run on our supercomputer using the entire machine essentially for an entire year. And it generated about 500 terabytes of data. So if you like 500 hard disk, and this is a small amount compared to other climate model simulations that we conduct. And so in total, we were able to simulate the Earth history for the last 3 million years. Now, this is a good starting point because, first of all, we have to compare it against paleoclimate data. Well, does the model actually reproduce some real data, ice core data or sediment core data? And then we can use this model to drive other offline models, in particular vegetation models. So this is a biome model. You will see some results later on. The mammal model, which I will introduce later on, and also agent-based models for humans that include genetics and so on and so forth. So this can be expanded depending on what kind of particular application you're interested in. Okay, just as an illustration here, what you can see in black is the simulated temperature at particular locations indicated here on this map. And then we have these are ocean locations. We have temperature reconstructions, proxy data from these locations in colors. And you can see overall it's actually quite well represented. There are some issues with the very early Pleistocene from 3 to 1.5 million years ago. Our model seems to have more precessional scale variability, whereas the observations have more obliquity, 40,000 year variability. But overall, in particular, if you go towards the end of the late Pleistocene, the model is doing actually really a good job. There are interesting aspects. You can see there is a trend here, cooling trend, which people have interpreted as response to the decreasing CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. But interestingly, if you go to Antarctica or Western South Pacific, you don't see that cooling trend in the observations, but in the model it's still there. So there are still some interesting issues. Not everything is perfectly resolved, but by and large, this model is capable of reproducing observations, even though it has never seen these observations before. Okay, this is another illustration here for temperatures, shorter time period, just the last 400,000 years. The red one is the climate model, the blue one, and the red ones are the proxy data from different locations. And you can just glance through it. Most of the precessional scale variability in the monsoon systems is nicely captured for rainfall proxies. And in the observations, we have this typical 100,000 year cycle associated with temperature and ice ages. and that is also nicely captured in our climate model. Okay, so that gives you an overall idea that the model is a useful tool to understand the climate system. Okay, now these data will be used as a forcing for this mammal model. But first, we need to think about how can we build a model, a mathematical model for 2,171 mammal species. Okay, so we need to come up with a concept to characterize species in a mathematical model, and that's not trivial. So our approach here is that we start off with the body mass of a mature animal from a particular species. Let's call the species I. Could be anything, could be an elephant. Okay, and oops. And another important aspect is they have a particular range, a particular climate preference, climate niche, or we can say a particular species distribution. And this is illustrated here for mammoth, for instance. These are all the records of mammoth from the paleobiological data sets, and we can identify what are the climate conditions using the climate model that these mammals experience when they lived at any particular location. And from that, we can build a statistical model. It's called a habitat suitability model. So this is very characteristic of a particular species. Okay, then what also matters is we need to know how quickly does a population grow. And this is characterized by so-called allometric relationships or metabiological relationships, where again, the body mass of a mature animal is a good condition for the growth rate. Okay, so this is important. The lifespan is important for our model. And again, Hutton has a paper where he compiled a lot of data sets in order to determine key metabolic indices as a function of body mass. And there seems to be an interesting universal scaling relationship for all mammals. Okay, we use these scaling relationships. The home range is really important. And from the home range and the lifespan, we can calculate something like a diffusivity over time. Then we need to know the base metabolic rates, or how much energy does a species need per day or per year. And again, this one is strongly determined by these body mass scaling relationships. Okay, so what we have is essentially metabiology or allometric scaling relationships, as well as the habitats, as well as the body mass is the key input. So this is not all, because we also need to place a species into a web of interactions. And this is controlled by, of course, their diets. So either they're carnivores, omnivores, insectivores, granivores, etc. So this is important. This is also something that we have for these 2,171 species. We have essentially a characterization of their main diet. Okay, so a squirrel is not going to compete in terms of food with, let's say, a wolf. So this has to be characterized somehow. Okay, and then we have also interactions. There is competition, predation, and this is based on the trophic level. And we also include sociality, the fact that certain animals, lions, are social hunters, tigers are not. Of course, lions can kill much larger prey than tigers because of that. Okay, so this is essentially the input. And again, here is the structure, the inputs and the forcing. So we have changes in climate, temperature, precipitation, and so on. Changes in sea level are important because we're looking at glacial cycles, and sometimes certain seaways open up when sea level goes up. And the species occurrence data from GBIF and our own Eutherian COP data set. Mammal traits I mentioned, and this essentially goes as the external forcing into this dynamical model. And inside, we are calculating these body mass scaling, space metabolic rate, etc. The habitat suitability is calculated. The net primary productivity is important. This is the food provided essentially by the vegetation for the herbivores. And then the key part is a set of 2,171 coupled partial differential equations. And that's a bit scary because that takes a lot of computing time. Anyways, so this is not to scare you off. I will just go very briefly through this. So this is kind of the core, the main reaction diffusion equation. So what do we have? Let's just say I is the species of, I don't know, this is some kind of antelope, I suppose. And we're looking at the change over time of the biomass of this particular antelope species. Okay, what drives this change? One is essentially they can move, right? They can go to other areas. And this is characterized here by this diffusion term. Okay, then we have the growth that I mentioned earlier on. So just population grows over time, but that's not all, because there is also mortality involved. And the mortality essentially is determined by this logistic term. So in this term, we have essentially this typical logistic quadratic relationship here. This is the competition with other species. This is typical Lotka-Volterra dynamics. And then in the down here, we have the carrying capacity of the species. And that is one of the key variables. The carrying capacity, let's say for herbivores, is essentially the food provided by the vegetation for this particular diet. Let's say frugivores. So, and this has to be multiplied with habitat suitability, because net primary productivity is very high in rainforest, but not everybody is living in the rainforest. Every species has their own individual species ranges. So this is kind of the key term. And then, of course, we have predation. And this is a typical predation term. We just square it for reasons I won't go into details here. Okay. For the carnivores, we have a similar equation. These guys move around, they grow over time, and they eat. And what do they eat? What's their carrying capacity? It's essentially herbivores. Well, there is also carnivores they can eat, but not every carnivore can eat every herbivore. Most likely a fox is not going to eat an elephant. So that is all captured in this matrix here that tells us who can eat whom, just because of physiological constraints. Okay, so this is essentially the key equation that we have to solve. And just to illustrate here, if you code this up, just this simple diffusion term becomes like a pretty lengthy, scary looking part, and it's very easy to make any mistakes in programming this. Okay, so let's just look at some of the outcomes here for the mammoth. And I mentioned already earlier on, habitat suitability is calculated internally because we use climate data. We link the climate data with the GBIF data and the Eutherium COP data, which is some paleobiology data, in order to calculate these habitat maps. But that's not what we're interested in. That itself is interesting, but we're really interested in how much kilogram of a particular species per square kilometer do we have, because that's a really interesting variable to have. And here on the right, you could see the changes here in this mammoth biomass over time. We can see a glacial termination here, and so on. Oh, okay. So another illustration here is just certain species under, let's say, last glacial maximum conditions. We have the reindeer here. This is all simulated in the model. The top here, I suppose, hippopotamus, gorilla, chimpanzee, and so on. And that really matches observations. So the model actually simulates the range, the geographic range, quite accurately, but it can also simulate how these different species interact with each other. So what we could do is an experiment where, let's say, we get rid of all the predators and see what's happening. Or we introduce a wolf in Austria under present day conditions. What's going to happen? So all of these experiments we can do now. And so this is an interesting one. This is a particular type of mouse or little rat. And this is particularly interesting right now because it's the carrier of this, the host of the Lassa virus, which is rapidly spreading. So we can even go into zoonotic diseases, because if we want to understand the spread of zoonotic diseases, we can run this model with future climate conditions and figure out, okay, is this mouse going to spread, or is its habitat going to shrink, or will there be more predators maybe taking care of this mouse, and so on and so forth. So this is very universally applicable, this model. Okay, here you can see if we integrate over all the different mammal species, we get something like the total biomass. And sorry, this is just very short run. Okay, you can see these are glacial, interglacial variations in the biomass. This itself is interesting because we have no idea how the global biomass on our planet changes for mammals in response to ice ages. Okay, that's one interesting aspect to look into, but we can also count the number of different species, for instance, at every grid point. So calculate something like the species diversity or richness, other ecologically relevant variables. So we can not only look at one individual species, but also at the connection, the web of species interactions. Okay, so I wanted to illustrate this further here by showing you results from a simulation that covers the last glacial interglacial cycle. So we start the model at 140,000 years ago, of course, in glacial state. Then 125,000 years ago, we have the interglacial state, marine isotope stage 5e, and then a few other changes in the system. And this is the total biomass simulated now in response to changes in Earth's astronomical orbit, ice age, ice sheet, ice volume changes, as well as changes in the net primary productivity from the climate system. Okay, and here is the last glacial maximum, and you can see the total biomass globally changes by about plus minus 25%, or the glacial interglacial range is 50%. That's actually a lot. If you think about glacial variations changing the global biomass of mammals by 50%, that's a large impact. And then you can imagine that certain species react to that even stronger than others. And these ones are perhaps the ones that are particularly vulnerable to human predation. With human density increasing, there is a risk then, of course, for particular vulnerable species to get extinct. And this is the pattern comparing the isotope stage 5e, the interglacial period, with the glacial period. And you can see, well, for interglacial periods, we have significantly more biomass in the high latitudes, also Europe, but also in parts of Africa. Here we see a reduction, and that's quite clear because under glacial conditions, we have a lot of productivity here because this is land, whereas as sea level rises, the Sunda Shelf and the Sahul Shelf become oceans, so they disappear. So that's why it's negative. Okay, so now just keep in mind, this is for the global biomass here, but we can do this for every species. Every species will have this variability, glacial, interglacial. Okay, now let's take a closer look at how different species actually react. But before we do that, this is just another way of looking at this. The data, body mass. So here we have the really heavy species, and here we have very light species like little mice and so on. And we can determine how much biomass globally is in each species. And what you see is, maybe it's not too surprising, but the heaviest species on our planet, even though they're not very abundant, they carry the largest amount of total biomass. I mean, there is some kind of scaling relationship here. Both of them are plotted logarithmically, but there is also some pretty large uncertainty, in particular for the smaller ones. So this is important. So if you become very hungry, let's say as a emerging Homo sapiens species, you can either go this direction and try to catch a lot of small mammals, or you can say, well, there is a lot of biomass here. I can simply try to learn how to catch them because there are much fewer of them. Okay, so this is then the figure that demonstrates the variations in the biomass, glacial, interglacial, in percent as a function of body mass. Let me explain that. So let's just pick one of these mammoths here. And so what we see is glacial, interglacial variability here captures about 20% of the variability in terms of the biomass. So this is relative variability. So we have the standard deviation divided by the mean, and that gives you essentially the idea that glacial interglacial changes impact this species maybe by plus minus 20%. Then there are other species that show much, much higher vulnerability to these climatic changes, but certainly not the very heavy ones. But we have a few of the still megafauna species here that are much more vulnerable, even above 50%. Okay, so we can invert now this figure on the left, and rather than looking at the biomass, we can divide the biomass by the body mass of each species, and that gives us a number of individuals. Okay, number of individuals, of course, is very high for small body masses. We can understand that there are a lot of mice on our planet, but very few elephants, and this is just illustrated here. So typically, the red list, IUCN red list, says a species would be endangered down here. And you can see actually in the natural state that our model simulates, none of the species is actually really endangered. However, that changes with humans coming in. And let's say we will look at this in more detail. The early Pleistocene humans, we had about maybe 100,000 or 10,000, 200,000 individuals living at every point in time. But as culture developed, as humans became more, widespread geographically, but also better hunters, more efficient predators, their population size, of course, went up, and with that also the demand for food. And then again, there is a question, which way would they go? Would they try to chase little mice, or would they try to chase larger prey? And this is something that we wanted to further quantify. But before we go there, this is another actually really interesting way of looking at this internally forced variability. For each species, we have these glacial, interglacial changes in the biomass. And so we can normalize these variations for each species and calculate a principal component analysis or empirical orthogonal function analysis. And so the dominant principal component looks like this over time. And this is the very well-known CO2 curve, essentially. So we can see in the biomass of particular species, the ones that have very high loadings actually here, that they would pretty much follow the cooling of our planet induced by CO2 and the expansion of ice sheets, and then eventually the warming into the Holocene. Now, the second principal component is interesting. It has this very strong precessional cycle, and that is driven, of course, by Earth's axis wobble, shifting the main rain bands on our planets back and forth. There are certain species that are particularly affected by this, and these are mostly the tropical ones and the ones that are living in the monsoon regions. However, the very heavy megafauna is not affected by this very much. They are more affected by the changes in CO2 and the ice sheets. So there is some regional information actually in this figure that's quite useful. Okay, now let's introduce humans. We can just say, well, humans are nothing else but another mammal in our model. Body mass, let's say 50 or 60 kilos, doesn't matter very much. They have a particular effective growth rate. We have estimates from that. The diffusivity, well, maybe about 70 square kilometer per year. It's maybe a bit overestimated, but we will just work with that right now. And then we need to say what kind of prey range are they actually interested in as a predator? Well, let's just say down to 1 kilo. Everything smaller is maybe not really worth hunting for. It goes to a certain number X. And that number X changes over time. Let's just say 100 kilos, no problem. But over time, humans, of course, learned how to hunt down larger prey, in particular mammoths and so on, or bisons. So this number we can essentially expand as the model is running in order to emulate culture. And so we introduce humans in this model, and this would be the geographic spread of humans around 28,000 years ago. Note that we have not included the island hopping into Australia here in the model, not yet. They're still working on this. But this is essentially the spread of humans around that time. And what you will see now is the difference between a simulation where we have humans included, being a very effective, hungry predator, and a simulation where we don't have humans included. And the first thing that you will see is this is a change in the total biomass on our planet due to humans. And this is the number of humans themselves. And you can see, well, they have this precessional variability. Overall, there is a bit under glacial conditions, there is a bit of a drop. And this one will show you, as an animation, will show you the percentage change per body mass due to human interference. And we are talking about the time period from 140,000 years ago to the Holocene, not into the Holocene, to around 10,000 years. Okay, let's go there. And the first thing that you see is there are certain species in this range, and this is exactly the range that was given initially for the human prey, the human prey range. And there, the total biomass of these species drops down. But you can see as this species or these species are reduced, there are new opportunities actually next to them. The smaller ones will be happy because there is less competition, and the larger ones will also be happy because there is less competition from the smaller ones. So you can see that by introducing humans as a very effective predator, there are beneficiaries of that entire system. And currently, in this particular simulation, the humans were only limited to have prey capabilities up to 100 kilograms. I wanted to show the simulation also that goes up to 3,000 kilograms, but it didn't finish overnight. So that's for another time to show. But you can easily imagine as humans get more effective in killing larger prey, this is going to affect these species as well. And now you can see we can essentially, based on the base metabolic rate that humans need, the energy requirements that humans need, and some assumptions about how large their prey range is, we can determine actually how much biomass they take out and how much can they contribute to the megafauna extinctions. Okay, how much time do I still have? Okay, good. So just a quick summary. So this is a new dynamical model for mammals, which is based on this allometric scaling, habitats, and reaction diffusion equations. And so far, I think this is the only global mammal model that exists. So if you have any interest, any questions regarding the data, please let us know. It's not published yet. We are working on the publication. And it simulates essentially the biomass of these species in space and time, and in response to different types of forcings or different types of scenarios. So we can just take out certain species and see what would happen. Keystone species, for instance, how important are they? The model would simulate the effect. Glacial interglacial variability reduces global biomass by 50%, which is actually a lot, and which makes these some populations in particular very vulnerable to predation from humans. And that could lead later on to an extinction of megafauna, but the final simulation I couldn't show today. It's still work in progress. Okay, so now let's switch over to simulating humans. And there is a second part of the story I wanted to show today. There are different types of models, and I spoke about it last time. The biogeographic models, essentially species distribution models. Then we have these reaction diffusion models, the ones that I indicated early on. But there is another type of modeling category, and these are agent-based models where we actually simulate individual humans and their entire life cycle. It's a bit like a computer game, and they can have children, and we can give everybody a genetic tag and see what are they doing actually. And so this is something that we built together with our colleagues in Zurich, Christoph Zollikofer group, and then we wanted to address an interesting question that came up in a recent study, and that is the question about whether there was a bottleneck around 900,000 years ago. And you may have heard about this study by Hu et al. 2023 in Science, as hotly debated, and also their biostatistical tools have been, I think, criticized. In any case, so the story here is that, let's say, prior to the mid-Pleistocene transition, a major climate transition around 900,000 years ago, early human species were very happy, and then something happened, nobody knows what, at least that's in the genetic data as they state, where essentially humans had to pass through this genetic bottleneck, and afterwards they were kind of okay until we had the major expansion then around 100,000 years ago. Okay, and they claim in this paper a severe population bottleneck occurred between 930 and 813,000 years ago, most likely due to climatic changes. But in this study, there is zero evidence for climate being the driver of this. I mean, it's an interesting hypothesis, but we are scientists, so we want to test hypotheses. And so this is essentially the starting point of our research on this. We wanted to see, is there actually something going on? And also in the context of this being very controversial, different statistical bioinformatic tools give very different answers on this bottleneck. So what's going on? Okay, was there a close shave for humanity, and what really happened? And for that, we built again this let's say infrastructure to drive essentially an agent-based model where we have individuals running around looking for food, having children, and so on and so forth. And of course, they need food, and the food is now provided to them. We didn't couple it yet to the mammal model, that will be the next step, but it's provided essentially by the net primary productivity. But these humans, they also have a habitat suitability, and it changes over time. The early humans, Homo ergaster and so on, they had a very narrow climatic preference, and over time that climate niche expanded. And this is something that we also had to include in order to have a realistic simulation. So climate forcing is again providing the information for the food resources and for the habitat suitability. And that goes essentially into this computer game, if you like. Okay, that computer game, what does it do? All right, so here you can see not the individuals, we are spinning the individuals, and we're looking at the density from 2 million years ago, pretty much to maybe 100,000 years ago. And you see, okay, here's something interesting happening right now. Okay, you can see the entire population structure collapses, and it recovers every once in a while here. So again, so it's highly dynamic. But in the beginning actually of the simulation, you could see we had a northern African population, and we had this intertropical convergence zone population, and they essentially disappear. And this is illustrated here. If we look at the density of individuals in this area, it pretty much collapses in the Central African region. Eastern Africa is like a refugium. It's very stable. Humans hang out there pretty in a stable way, except for this precessional cycles. And then South Africa, actually, we have this massive collapse of the population size, and well, some recoveries later on. And this is all driven by climate and food resource availability. Okay, so what can we make out of that? So first of all, this is again the total population, and you can see in the total population, there is not much of a major drop in the population size, a little bit, maybe 20%. But overall, the African population didn't suffer that much from this mid-Pleistocene transition. However, particular regions did. So the population structure itself collapsed, and that led to a major disruption or destruction of genetic diversity. Keep in mind, we give every human in the model mitochondrial DNA. We can also give them Y chromosome and so on. And we have a hereditary model that essentially allows us to trace the individual DNA of people over 2 million years. And so this is where really we have this collapse in the genetic diversity. And interestingly, some recoveries later on, which we can discuss later on, and they they occur during interglacial periods. I suppose this is marine isotope stage 11, 9, and this would be 13. Okay, so something's happening. So our model, which does not know anything about the WHO study, is essentially showing, well, climate impacted the population structure, and that had an imprint on the population diversity, genetic diversity. Okay, you can also see that in phylogenetic trees. So in the model, we can pick people individually, randomly, and reconstruct these phylogenetic trees using software like Beast and so on. And again, you see these regional populations essentially disappear. Okay, we wanted then to know what is the main climate driver behind it. Is it rainfall, temperature? Is it vegetation? Because all of them influence actually the individuals. And it turned out most of it is due to a change in the net primal productivity. So this is the genetic diversity that I showed earlier on. And then 900,000 years ago, there is this collapse. Why is there a collapse? Number one, because during that time, the atmospheric CO2 concentrations reduced dramatically, which changes the available net primal productivity. So we have a drop in the net primal productivity. Precipitation itself didn't matter that much, but temperature and net primal productivity are the main reasons for driving these habitat changes and a reduction in food resources for these early human populations in South Africa. Now, of course, these populations have recovered. Why have they recovered? Well, in the first simulation, we did not include cultural evolution. Now, we conducted another simulation where we said, well, these guys are also getting smarter over time. So with fewer food resources, over time, they're handling this much better. So this is a concept known as cultural carrying capacity. As culture increases, which we can see in the complexity of stone tools that people try to quantify, we can essentially increase the carrying capacity of humans over time. And what that leads to is essentially an increase in the population size and a complete recovery here from the genetic bottleneck. And that would occur, and you can see these 100,000-year cycles. Again, this is quite nice, the glacial interglacial cycles in the diversity of DNA. Okay, so this is a scenario. Whether it's realistic is another point, but by introducing essentially a growing efficiency to extract resources from the environment, food resources, as emulated here by this cultural change, we can see that essentially humans recover, both in terms of population size and also genetic diversity. Okay, so this is a pretty stunning result, I thought, because I didn't expect this climate forcing to have such a large impact on the diversity. It doesn't have on population size, but the diversity is affected. So if we look at this entire story of human evolution here, we recently had a study on another population bottleneck around 1.126 million years ago for Homo erectus. But this one is right now something where, well, maybe some major event occurred. And if you have a shrink in the diversity and population size, meta-population structure, it can also allow for selection if you have different groups. So selection can really start to play an important role. And so here, this is where this bottleneck occurred. Interestingly, and this is nothing else but a coincidence right now, we have this chromosome merger. So prior to that mid-Pleistocene transition, we had 24 chromosomes, goes times 2, and then afterwards 23 chromosomes, which is kind of interesting. Not sure if it's the same relationship as me coming to Vienna and it rains always, or if there is something behind it. But let's just leave it up there. And also, if you look at the early humans prior to that, well, these were pretty regional dwellers. They had very narrow climate niches. And afterwards, with Heidelbergensis, of course, emerging as a global wanderer, fire maker and tool maker, we also see a change in the size of the prefrontal cortex, an indicator of social activity and also other cognitive skills. So not sure if this is the cause, but this is something maybe for future research to explore. Okay, so with that, I'll think just wanted to say this is an interesting field coming together, or you can call it geoanthropology or geoecology. So we are starting to bring different fields under one roof: genomics, anthropology, archaeology, paleoclimate, biology, and I think it's a wonderful, let's say, situation right now also for early career researchers to learn something about other fields and maybe contribute to a bigger understanding of environmental drivers of human evolution. Okay, so with that, I thank you for your attention.